Hi there, I'm Justin Barrett, president of Blueprint 1543, and I'm also a former professor and a psychological scientist. And today, I'd like to talk to you about, well, what babies know and how we know and why it even matters. When I was a doctoral student, I had the fortune of having our first child, and okay, I didn't birth the baby, my wife did, but you get the point. And at the university where I was studying, Cornell University, there was a really active baby lab. And so immediately our son was recruited to be a participant in the baby lab, which means he became a human subject of these weird little experiments. And the director of the baby lab at the time, Elizabeth Spelke, was also the co-director of the lab group I was a part of. So I got to hear a lot about infant studies and other studies involving children that don't speak a lot. And so I got to learn a little bit about how it is that scientists sort of get into the heads of these little blobby things, with giant heads and short hands, who are short arms, not T-Rexes, the babies, and how we know what they know and why that matters. So that's what I wanted to share a little bit because it's kind of fun and it's kind of important. First, I think I want to dispel this idea that until babies learn how to talk, nothing is going on in their heads, or that they're just, sort of cute potato looking things and that's about it. They actually have a lot more going on. They're thinking about more things and they're understanding the world a lot more than in previous generations we realized. And part of that is because in a lot of Western traditions, we've inherited this idea that somehow babies come into the world as an empty vessel that's just waiting to be filled up by whatever inputs their parents give them or the surrounding culture. Sometimes this is called the tabula rasa, or blank slate view of babies' minds. William James, who is sort of the father of American pragmatism, a school of philosophy, but also called the father of American psychology, referred to babies sort of seeing the world as a blooming, buzzing confusion. And that's sort of a common idea that we seem to have in our cultural environment, that babies just know nothing until we start teaching them stuff or until they start experiencing stuff in the world. They're a blank slate. In recent decades, we've got really good evidence that that's just not the case. And it's not because of language. Language, of course, helps us think. But we do an awful lot of thinking without language, and the study of babies has helped us see that. So how do you get inside of a baby's head? How do you know? Well, just like in studying other animals that don't talk, it requires careful observation and really getting to know what are the behavioral tendencies that we can observe in babies, and then designing very careful experiments or observational paradigms in which we can tell kind of something about what they're thinking. We can make inferences about what's going on inside their heads by so subtly changing things and comparing different conditions and looking at how babies behaviorally react. We can do this with even newborns and babies that don't move very much by looking at things like, well, where do their eyes go? What are they looking at? What's their sucking rate? Because babies are always sucking things. They stick things in their mouth. Clever psychological scientists working in developmental psychology, for instance, have hooked up, electrical cables to pacifiers to measure sucking rates. And then they can give babies different displays and see how their sucking rate changes. So there are these really interesting and subtle indirect measures of what's going on in the head, these outward behaviors that can help us see. Kind of summarizing the work of people like René Bayerjean, Elizabeth Spelke, Philippe Rashad, Karen Wynn, Paul Bloom, Andy Meltzoff, Mike Tomasello, and many others. What we have to do when we're trying to figure out what babies know and are thinking is we have to pool across lots of different cases. Any one baby isn't going to tell you the whole story. But if we look at lots of different babies, preferably across lots of different cultural environments too, we can start seeing what the general patterns are, and then we can make inferences about what's going on in their heads. So we have to pool across lots of cases. One of the biggest reasons for this, and it's a real practical kind of thing when you're doing baby research, is a lot of them just fall asleep during the research, or they throw a fit and then they fuss out, it's called, and then they're not giving you any data. So this is hard work and it takes a lot of creativity, but there really has been this revolution in the last roughly 30 years that's radically changed what we think babies know. A fun example of this is the work of Andy Meltzoff. Meltzoff and Moore were famous for looking at whether babies can imitate facial expressions at very, very early ages. These are mostly observational types of studies where babies are born, right? They come out of mom, and then there's this strange scientist who's doing things like sticking their tongue out at the baby. And we measure how often the baby sticks their tongue out after seeing this researcher stick their tongue out, or making this face, or whatever facial expression. So, ah, or those kinds of things, and then see, does that increase the likelihood that the baby makes a similar facial expression? And of course, that can be done experimentally. You can take a baby who didn't see, they maybe see just this face, and you measure how often they won't, versus they see this face and see how often they go. Or they see this face and we measure how often they go. Or they see this face and we measure how often they go.
Do so another example.
Or they see this face, which I call the Zoolander. And we see how often they do. Right, or that kind of thing, right? So that's the basic idea, is we can do controlled studies, and this is what Meltzoff and Moore did, at different ages from within minutes or hours or days of birth, and see, can babies imitate certain facial expressions? And at least one, the sticking out the tongue thing, seems to be there very early, and these other ones come along too, and other researchers have followed up, and we find really strong evidence that at shockingly young ages, babies are imitating faces, facial expressions. And this is really cool. Why? Well, because presumably when babies come out, they don't know they have a face, right? They're fresh to the world. They haven't seen a mirror. They haven't explored their own faces and went, oh, okay, I see a tongue coming out of you. How did I do that? No, they don't do that stuff, right? Somehow they know how to map that person's face onto the musculature of their own face and make these expressions, and they seem inclined to do it. That's pretty cool. It's pretty wild. Similarly, we know that babies from birth basically are selectively attending to faces and face-like information in the environment. There's all of this information out there, and they're automatically looking for faces. Simon Baron-Cohen was one of the researchers who was looking into these kinds of things. They've also managed to show that boy babies actually do this a little bit less than girl babies, interestingly. They both look for human faces, but girls seem to have even stronger preference. So putting these two pieces of research together, from birth, roughly, babies are coming out looking for human faces, and then they're quickly imitating those. Why might that be important? Well, it gets them interacting right away, socially interacting with other human beings, and that's important because we learn so much from each other. And then they're imitating and learning what it means to imitate. And that's, of course, how we learn to manipulate things in the environment and so forth and so on, which is so important for the social kind of animal that we are. So that's pretty cool stuff that seems to be there right from birth. Researchers have come up with really interesting ways of figuring this out. An example of what babies know really early that lots of people have heard about is called the object permanence test. This goes back to Jean Piaget, who's sort of the grand old man of developmental psychology. He made this claim based on his observations that if you've got an object out there that a baby wants, and you hide that object in some way, the baby acts as if it has fallen out of existence. Babies of a certain age, up until a certain age, it's just gone in their experience, right? They don't know it exists anymore. It's been suggested this is true of other humans in their environment too. So mom just disappears out of existence at certain points. You know, she leaves the room, she's gone. She comes back, they're like, cool, mom, you've come back into existence. It's not that mom left, it's that mom sort of evaporated and is gone forever. This is the basic idea is object permanence, and you can do these demonstrations with babies before they're walking and stuff. You can do the whole, here's an object, and they're like, yeah, that's cool. And then you go like that, and then they go, and they act like, what? And it's only when they're a little bit older, they go, move that thing out of the way and give me that spongy red brain thing, whatever this thing is. But more recent studies have suggested that actually object permanence is there a lot earlier, like maybe 5 months old. a lot earlier than it was, pretty much as early as we can get babies to stay awake and not soil themselves and stay in the study. Well, how do you do that? Well, it takes some pretty careful experimental methods, and I'll explain that in a minute. But what they build upon, most of these studies, or at least an awful lot of these studies, build upon the idea that babies, once they've got pretty decent focus and are looking around the world around them, they pay attention to things until it gets boring, and then they lose interest because novelty is exciting to them most of the time. There are a few exceptions. Those human faces are one of those exceptions. They're drawn to human faces whether they're boring or not most of the time. But in general, they look at things that they're interested in, and then they lose interest and they look at something else. Okay? Which means we have an indirect way of measuring whether babies think something is new information by seeing if it recovers their attention once they're bored with something. So it's called habituation, dishabituation. Habituation, you get them bored with something, and so let me look at it. Okay, I've had enough of that. And then you show something new, and they go, ooh, look at there. I'm, of course, elaborating a little bit, but you get the point. So habituation, bore them until they're squirming and looking all over the place, and then give them something new and see if they dishabituate. Does it recover their attention? If it does, you know they saw something new. If it doesn't, well, maybe they saw something new and it was still boring. It's not as clear what's going on there, but if they dishabituate, that's good information to have. Okay, so then we can set up a child with a display, again with that sort of object thing, and we'll pretend this is a little wall and I'm the baby, okay? And I see, the experimenter shows me my cool object here that I'm interested in. I go, wow, that's great. And then you hide it behind the object, the wall. And then, and this is where the experimental part comes in, either in one condition, the little wall drops and it sort of propped up on the thing at a slope, or the wall goes all the way down to the tabletop. And what researchers have been able to show is this: the babies go, still not interested. But if it goes all the way down, they're like, whoa, what just happened there? As if they knew that the object was behind there. That is, the object was permanent. Even though they couldn't see it, it was there. So we, across lots of studies of that sort, we now know that actually very young babies have some kind of sense of objects existing continuously. They have permanence. They still exist even when I can't see them. So you might wonder, well, how did such a brilliant guy like Jean Piaget get it wrong then? And why is it that when you just sort of hide something from babies, they stop looking for it and they act like, oh, okay. Well, interestingly, across lots of studies, it seems to suggest there's a dissociation in little babies between their sort of attention, their visual attention, and their eagerness or ability even to reach for things. So the reaching system and the watching system are actually two different systems that have to grow together and be zippered together. So what seems to happen in those old object permanence studies is, it's not that the babies don't think it's there on a certain level, it's that, oh, well, now it's not the kind of thing it's worth me reaching for. So I'm going to stop reaching for it, strangely. So that's kind of cool. We're learning those kinds of things. What are other ways that we can sort of infer what babies know? Well, we can examine what they learn very quickly. And that tells us something about what's going inside their heads. For instance, babies and even captive monkeys can be conditioned to be afraid of snakes after a single exposure sometimes. What do I mean by that? I mean, like, they see a videotape of someone reacting in fear to a snake, and now they're afraid of snakes. All they have to do is see it one time. If their mom goes, ah, spider, now I'm afraid of spiders. Ah, snake, now I'm afraid of snakes. I just saw mom react in fear to the snake. Now I'm afraid of snakes. Of course, this doesn't work with everything. And this is where it gets interesting, right? Is if mom acts like she's afraid of flowers, baby's probably not going to be afraid of flowers. You might think mom has got something wrong with her, but the baby's not going to become afraid of flowers. Or, afraid of, I don't know, wooden coasters or books or even cell phones. Those aren't the kinds of things that babies seem to have a natural, it's called preparedness, to form a fear association with. But snakes, yes. Spiders, likely. Okay, so there are a few things in the world that We seem to come into the world just sort of having this natural preparedness to form certain kinds of reactions, emotional reactions, behavioral reactions to that thing. And careful study with babies can reveal that sort of thing. What these sorts of studies cumulatively have started to show us is that there's actually a lot of contour. There's a lot of topography, or whatever metaphor you want, for what's going on in children's minds that then structures the learning that they do in the rest of their life. And for this reason, there's certain types of ideas in their culture that they're going to confront that are going to be easier or harder to think, that are easier or harder to learn. There are certain kinds of associations with feelings that are going to come more naturally. So it turns out there is some kind of core common human nature that shapes the way that we think. It shapes the way that we learn. It makes some things hard and some things easy. And that may account for why it is, even when we're much older, why it is that it takes so much more work to learn some things than others. Why it is that teachers have to really drill certain types of ideas, whereas other ones are a piece of cake. Why it is even as grown-ups we make funny mistakes, like, for instance, some of us we know our snakes and we know there are no scary snakes around here, but we're still afraid of the little wiggly thing that crawls by our path. Even though up here we know not dangerous. Down here we go, hey, yeah, or down somewhere else. I don't know where, maybe this part of the brain, somewhere deep in there that I can't really point to. So we've got this certain kind of human nature that bears on our psychology that can be studied by looking at infants. And these very clever experiments have helped pull back the curtain on that and better understand what it is that babies think, why they think it, and why it matters. So that's my sort of warm-up act for what babies think. Let me know what you think. If you want to learn more about that, we can talk more about the particulars. And at a future episode, I'm looking forward to talking to you about how the furniture or the contours of natural thought then leads us to find some cultural systems like religious beliefs more natural than other cultural systems like, say, scientific thinking. But I'm Justin Barrett from Blueprint 1543. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe and do all of those things that you do, and just keep watching. If this tickles your fancy, send me comments if there's certain kind of content you'd like to see us develop. Thanks for joining me.